Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Now, one of the things that I think was great about the Napoleonic Wars was that the established order of things was completely overthrown. Certainly in France it was. The son of a cooper could become a prince, or the orphaned wharf rat one of the premier marshals of France. But that wasn't the case over here in Britain. Here tradition reigned, and families followed destinies set down by the generations. So it was with the subject of today's Napoleonic figures. Not only was he a great commander in his own right, but generations both sides of him had their own legends to forge. Today we will be discussing the man Wellington called, quote, the best man of his rank in the entire army, end quote, and who certainly had the best name of anyone in the entire war. This is the story of General Sir Manley Power. Manley Power was born in Herefordshire in 1773. His grandfather was a captain of the Battle Axe Guards, the Dublin Castle equivalent of the Beefeaters, and his father, also brilliantly named Bolton Power, was a captain in both the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War, as our American cousins would call it. On the 27th of August, 1783, at the ripe old age of 10, Manley enlisted into his father's regiment, the 20th of Foot. By 1795, now a captain, leading his own company of soldiers, the regiment was stationed in Nova Scotia, where he would be promoted to major. At this point, it's worth remembering that promotion as an officer in the British Army was very unusual, a relic of a bygone time. It was done through buying commissions, literally paying the government for your rank. The more prestigious the regiment, the more expensive the commission. That said, there was also an order of seniority, usually based on the length of service, but men could be boosted up for particularly impressive exploits. And the constant action in the Napoleonic Wars, these remarkable officers would gain the chance to show themselves. In the East Devonshires, not being a particularly noteworthy regiment, the cost would be £3,200, which is just shy of £300,000 of today's money. So yeah, not cheap. But Manley Power was soon to get his money's worth though, being returned to Europe and deployed in the invasion of Holland in 1799. This invasion is something of a cool anomaly and allows British and Russian forces to fight side by side, as at the Battle of Castricum. However, the expedition, led by an inexperienced and more importantly indecisive Duke of York, did not go well. In fact, it was so bad that British school children still learn today the nursery rhyme, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them down again. Suitably chastened, the Duke of York left his future war plans to the professionals, and the 20th of Foot, along with Major Manley Power, was soon transferred to another front, the Mediterranean. In 1800, he participated in the capture of Minorca, a campaign that would be a fantastic Black Seas/sharp practice crossover game. On the island, one of the engagements was the storming of numerous walled towns, something that would have long echoes for Manley throughout the following decade. From Minorca, the fleet then moved on to Egypt, taking part in the Battle of Alexandria under the command of Sir Ralph Abercrombie. The Battle of Alexandria is one of my favourite battles of the Napoleonic War. How many other battles do you see fought in amongst ancient ruins? Victory was total, and it was the first time a British army had defeated a revolutionary army in the field. I mean, to be fair, it was a half-starved, diseased, tried, demoralised French revolutionary army, but it was still a French revolutionary army. The French fled to the fort of Alexandria, and after a short siege, surrendered. With Egypt back in the hands of the British, back in the hands of the rightful authorities of the Mamelukes, Manley and the 20th made their way back to England, stopping off at the recently acquired British Crown Island of Malta. After a few months here, he went back to Old Blighty, where he was placed on half pay. He took this opportunity to marry his first wife Sarah, with whom he had a son, imaginatively also called Manley. Although I haven't said that, if his name is going to be Manley Power, then it's not bad anyway, is it? And the younger Manley would later go on to be a colonel of the 85th Regiment. But Manley Senior, the chap who is the focus of our video here, that's a bit confusing, would use this opportunity to buy himself a cheap lieutenant colonelcy of the 20th of Foot. But he wasn't out to grass for long though, as in 1803 he received the first of his postings that would define his legacy. He was made Assistant Adjutant General at Horse Guards. Now, I have read that he had this position at the Horse Guards, but I think the author's a bit confused about what the term Horse Guards actually means. It's not the name of a regiment, but of an institution, sort of a Georgian version of the army part of the Ministry of Defence. I mean, it's not really, but that'll do for now as a rough guide of what Horse Guards was. It was located at the top of the Mall and is still where the trooping of the colour takes place every year. Well, that's on Horse Guards Parade, but yeah, it's behind it basically. So this would be reorganisation work. The British Army had had a mixed time of it recently. Defeated in America, they were successful against what I'll call colonial armies, especially in India, but further disasters had occurred in South America and the previously mentioned Holland campaign. What was needed was root and branch reform, but within the bounds of time. Experimental units such as riflemen were created and improved upon, and fire discipline combined with aggression was the order of the day. It's worth remembering too that these reforms were done under the threat of invasion. At the very moment Manley Power sat in his office at the top of the Mall, drawing up these plans and reforms, Napoleon was encamped with his armies on the Channel coast, drilling and training his men into the finest fighting formation seen certainly since the Roman legions, possibly ever in Europe. This was potentially life or death. And of course we know now that no invasion would ever come, due in no small part to the efforts of Nelson off Cape Trafalgar, but they didn't know this at the time. By 1811 these reforms were finished, and having escaped the disaster of Moore's first expedition to the Peninsula, a now 38-year-old Manley Power, full colonel of the 32nd Cornwall Regiment of Foot, went to war. He arrived on June 1811 and was immediately sent to the front. He wasn't to serve with his regiment though. Wellington had other ideas for this new arrival. Now this is pure speculation here, but Wellington had around him a tight group of battle-hardened senior officers who he'd fought and bled alongside. Black Bob Crawford, Sir Thomas Picton, Sir Stapleton Cotton, and, while only a colonel, this rapidly rising new guy sent by Horse Guards could have been someone that Wellington didn't want around. Additionally, the recently expanded Portuguese army needed whipping into shape, and, wouldn't you know it, the guy that's been doing that behind a desk for a half-dozen years to the British Army would be the perfect guy to try it in the field. Colonel Power was made a brigade commander of the 3rd Division, or the Fighting Third as they were known, under Sir Thomas Picton, a no-nonsense commander. While he remained a commissioned officer of the British Army, his division was made up of 2 regiments of Portuguese line infantry, the 9th and 21st, each of 2 battalions. It was these troops that he would lead into his first major battle, a favourite of mine, Fuentes de Onoro. Here the 3rd Division would be engaged in vicious hand-to-hand fighting in the streets of the village, eventually throwing the French troops out back across the river. The 3rd was not an easy posting, and they would live up to their moniker as the Fighting Third. Their next obstacle would be another appalling test, the walls of the fortress of Badajoz. Here the 3rd had perhaps the most unenviable task. They were to perform an escalade on a section of the wall away from the main breach as a diversionary attack. An escalade was literally throwing ladders up against the wall and trying to get to the top before the defenders could shoot, throw rocks and other nasties at you, or just destroy the entire ladder. Amazingly, this escalade broke through and created a second bridgehead from which to take the town. During the assault, General Picton was shot and wounded, forcing Manley Power to expose himself to fire and encourage his men on. For his bravery in this action, he was personally commended in the House of Lords. Quote, "Ordered that the Lord Chancellor do communicate the resolution of Friday last, giving the thanks of this House to Marshal Sir William Carr Beresford, Knight of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, Brigadier General Dennis Pack, and Brigadier Manley Power." End quote. With the final liberation of Portugal complete and the gates to Spain wide open, Wellington moved into the central Spain. With Picton still recovering from his wounds, command of the 3rd Division was given to Major General Pakenham, a figure that Manley Power would operate under again later in his career. It was under this new commander that the 3rd would engage the French at Salamanca. Powers as Portuguese as they were known would form part of the blocking detachment, the units that would engage the French column head and stop them. The unit under his command had been supplemented with the 12th Cazadores being added. These were the elite skirmishers, and by the time of Salamanca, the Portuguese were the equal of any British redcoat. Working in concert with the cavalry division, the 3rd first forced the French into square and then flailed them with musket fire. Still the French held, but a bayonet charge was enough to force them to flee. After Salamanca, Colonel Manley Power was transferred full-time to the Portuguese army, there to serve under Sir William Beresford, and to be given, as opposed to buying, the rank of Major General. That's probably why he went, to be honest. A lot of British officers and non-commissioned officers were transferred to Portuguese units and given a rank higher than the one they currently held for free. So that was worth a lot of money. This was a largely political and administrative change, however, as he and his 5 battalions of Portuguese, 2 each of the 9th and 21st Line regiments, and 1 of the 12th Caçadores, would still be part of the fighting 3rd Division, now once again under Picton, and they would fight together for the rest of the war. Brigadier General Manley Power would command his men at Vitoria, where the 3rd suffered heavy casualties, at over 1,800, making up 33% of the total Allied losses that day. After crossing the French border, they fought a final battle at Naville, where Powers' Portuguese would cap their reputation by seizing and holding a bridge despite heavy resistance and in the face of heavy counterattacks. By now it was 1814 and the war was over. Napoleon surrendered, but of course he would be back. Manley Power, however, would not be at Waterloo to face him. Instead, the war over, Powers' time with the Portuguese was also over. They awarded him one of their highest honours, Knight Commander of the Order of the Tower and Sword with Cross and Clasp. He and Beresford had helped turn a small but professional army into one that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the greatest in the world. When Wellington was making his stand on Mont Saint-Jean, Lieutenant General Power and 2 Peninsula colleagues would be over 3,500 miles away in America. Lieutenant General Power and Major General Thomas Brisbane, the commander of the 1st Brigade of the Fighting 3rd, and the guy who the Australian city is named after, as well as Major General Frederick Robinson, a former brigade commander from the 5th Division, were sent to stiffen the troops during the War of 1812 on the American-Canadian border. Something that time and again General Power was interested in was the quality of officers, particularly in their intelligence and ability. This is what he would be assessing on the American frontier. In his letters, Wellington remarked several times that after the war, Manley Power would inspect regiments, including the previously elite British troops. He recounts that, quote, Sir Manley Power discovered in his inspection of the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, that the officers failed to ensure the correct payment of their men, a failure certain to lead to poor performance levels. Power also wrote that the lieutenants of the 1st Battalion, 57th Regiment, were, and Wellington quotes here, not very intelligent, end of quote. While this inspection was undertaken in 1818, in 1814 he found similar problems in America, being appalled at the low quality of officers from the junior ranks to the very top. He blamed the timidity of the Commander-in-Chief Sir George Prevost for losing the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York State. Instead of using his newly arrived veterans as his top commanders and relying on their expertise, Prevost placed Francis de Rottenberg in charge of the infantry, while Power, Brisbane and Robinson each had a brigade of about 3,500 troops under their command. Following the failure of a British naval squadron, de Rottenberg ordered the attack to stop, despite the experienced brigade commanders believing that they could have easily captured Plattsburgh. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their opinions carried far more significant weight in Britain than Rottenberg's, and Prevost was removed from command. The Duke of Wellington was particularly unimpressed. On the 30th of October 1814 he wrote, quote, It is very obvious to me that you must remove Sir George Prevost. I see he has gone to war about trifles with the general officers I sent him, which are certainly the best of their rank in the army, and his subsequent failure and distresses will be aggravated by that circumstance, and will probably, with the usual fairness of the public, be attributed to him. End quote. Prevost was replaced by the man that had commanded Manley Power in Salamanca, Sir Edward Pakenham. It was under the command of this man, assisted by Wellington's former Quartermaster General, Sir George Murray, that Power would engage at the Battle of New Orleans on the 8th of January 1815. This battle was a complete disaster for the British, and Pakenham was killed by grape shot. He would go down in American legend. As it turned out, though, the battle was actually meaningless, the Treaty of Ghent having already ended the war, unbeknownst to its combatants. Wellington, by then an almost demigod, blamed the Navy, particularly Admiral Corcoran, so Power was exonerated. He returned to England for just long enough to receive the honour of the Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, and from there back to the 3rd Division for the occupation of France, being ultimately responsible for the evacuation of British troops at the occupation's end. He achieved it so well that the Mayor of Calais wrote, quote, "To express my thanks for the considerate treatment of the French and of the town of Calais during the embarkation," end quote. Once back in England, he married for a second time. Now, to be honest, I'm not really sure what happened to his first wife, but this time he married Anne Evans, the daughter of Kingsmill Evans, a colonel of the Grenadier Guards. His eldest son by her, Kingsmill Manley Power, which is also a great name, was a captain in the 9th 16th Lancers and would serve with great distinction in India. As we saw earlier, he remained on the army staff, conducting inspections of the army and not suffering fools. He returned to Canada briefly before receiving his final posting in another return to a place he had visited in his youth, Malta. He had visited there on his way back from Egypt 18 years previously, and this time he would return not as a soldier, not as an inspector, but as Governor-General of Malta. Upon his return, he suffered a short illness when passing through Switzerland and died only 53 in Bern. He was buried at Bath Abbey, and there is still a tombstone there that you can see to this day. So that's the end of Sir Manley Power, a member of one of the most military families in British history. He was as much a reformer as a soldier, brave and not willing to suffer fools. He was the man that Wellington needed, and he turned the Portuguese soldier into one that any British soldier would have fighting by his side. How does he operate on the tabletop? Well, he doesn't have any specific rules in Albion Triumphant Volume 1, but my suggestion would be to make him a strategy rating 8 British General. Models-wise, there isn't anything that's specifically him, but I think it could be quite cool if on his command base he had maybe a Portuguese ADC with him, or just some Portuguese infantry or something like that, just to give you the impression that, he's a British commander who's wearing just normal British general outfit, but he's actually commanding Portuguese troops. His brigade, that was made up of the Catadores and the 2 line infantry regiments, the 8th and the 21st, I would make those troops have all the rules for British. I would just treat them as British. They'd have steady line, they'd have all that good stuff. And the Catadores I would treat as British riflemen. Simple as that, really. I think they are as well trained and equipped as the British. And I would just give them all the British special rules, just treat them as British regiments in all intents and purposes. So that's it. So that's Sir Manley Power. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this Napoleonic figures. If you've got any ideas for someone you'd like to see, remember this series is based on the heroes and the stories of the Napoleonic period that are somewhat less known. So I'm trying to steer away from marshals and things like that. It's the lesser known, maybe more esoteric guys out there. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.